forth. So just hang tight, and we'll make sure everyone has a chance to join before we jump into the styled maps. You're welcome to say hi, though, if you have a question. I think we, by default, have people on mute as they join. So see if we can get you unmuted in case you had an immediate question while we're waiting for some more folks.
I do, about Hangouts, so not about maps. I'll save the maps questions for when there's more people. But okay. Mano included a link to the Google Moderator, and there were different events in Google Moderator, so different previous instances of the office hours. But the link he sent was empty. So by default, when you went there, I believe it was empty, or maybe I didn't wait long enough for it to refresh. So I guess for someone who hasn't used it much, what is the protocol for adding new questions? What is the right spot to add new questions?
Well, probably the right spot is to tell us that we made a small mistake and it should have taken you directly to this week's moderator rather than the default moderator for all our previous ones. So sorry for the confusion there. Next week, we'll make sure that the link is right and it goes to the appropriate moderator. But for future reference, if you do come across something like that, generally the most recently created one is at the top. So if you selected the top left one, and it should have a description like moderator questions for this Hangout.
Oh, okay.
So there's a list of 5 or 6 previous ones like you noted on the left. So just pick the top one and add your question there. But yeah, next week we'll double check and make sure it goes to the correct week instead of just the default list of all of them. And you're welcome to ask any maps questions as well. We can always make you repeat them later.
Oh, sure. So I have added a couple that I put in moderator, which may or may not be in the right place. And sorry for my head appearing large suddenly. I was turning off a small heater that I was using. So my questions were the ones about, they were related to map controls. So I didn't know that today's topic was styled maps, which really interests me. So I'm looking forward to that. But I've seen the MVC how-to, so using the circle and using MVC controls using the API. And I've seen the couple of examples in the example section of the developer documents, which is a home control and a state-saving home control. But I've been looking for style guides. Specifically, I wanted to create a control, for instance, that is like a full screen control for ours that looks like the control that is map/satellite. And I can tell from looking at the CSS that it's browser dependent and resolution dependent. And essentially I was asking, is there a way to recreate that? I mean, I could have CSS that has those thousands of rules and sort of do if IE, if Chrome, if Safari, if
Sure.
this other thing. But really I wanted to know what is the right way to do that?
Yes, so there's 2 general approaches here, I think. One is to file a feature request that we should publish our CSS or some way of doing this in the API where you can not have to worry about sort of copy and pasting the CSS. But there's also a way you can create, for example, I think it's an overlay control. I'll have to check the reference in a second. Sort of button that shows up next to your other map layers. And you can customize that to do whatever you want. So as long as you're happy with it being part of, for example, a layer control, it'll look like your map and satellite buttons, but it can do whatever it is that you might want. That's not necessarily just switching a layer. An example of this is the Google Earth API utility library, which is part of our Maps v3 third-party utility libraries.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a button there that says Earth. We just added a button sort of next to the other ones. But you click it, and it calls a bunch of custom code that has an end result of putting divs on top of the map and showing that plugin and so on and so forth, even though it's technically part of the layer control. So
yeah, I've seen those.
That would be one way to sort of get, so no matter what happens, even if we change the style of those buttons in future versions or whatever, your button will match. But it doesn't give you the ability to put it in some other control elsewhere. Although again, you can put those controls off in a separate div and so forth.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that, and I work at a university, so I've seen examples of other universities doing complete custom controls. They build the entire thing themselves, usually for their own layer controls and for their own searches and branding and so forth.
So if you did want it to match ours exactly, I mean, it's a little bit of a hack, but yeah, you might want to look at that example of the Earth API utility library, and then you could have that control do whatever it is that you wanted to have it do.
I like that. I would never have thought of inserting into that array, sort of having the box of, well,
yeah,
that's
as long
a layer
as you don't
control.
mind the sort of proximity of your control to the layer.
Right. That actually helps a lot. I'll have to play with that.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, 1 for 1. I like that. Excellent. Yes, thank you. Well, yes, I struggled with the same question myself when I was building that library, and that was
Oh, you created it. That's you. You're the author of that.
I am the author of that one. And I had a similar question, which is I have access to all of the CSS and so forth, but it didn't seem appropriate to, even if we did publish the CSS, because we're going to change that, in future versions, and then it would be out of date and so forth.
So what does it look like for you? I mean, it's even inline, so I'm imagining that you're not, those things aren't inline styles when you are on, sort of the Google side of the world. Do you all use something, I guess you use Google
library and pretty much all of the tools that our team on Maps Developed Relations put out use the public, APIs, the exact same endpoint APIs that you have.
Oh.
All I meant is that I do happen to have also access to the code, so if I felt so inclined, I could have filed a similar feature request and said, hey, and this is actually a great way that we kind of are able to make things as developer-friendly as we can. As we build these tools, we struggle with the same things you guys would struggle with. And then when we chat to you in Hangouts, we hear the feedback you have, and then we can go to our engineers and say, hey, this is a problem that we should try to solve. And so, if it turned out in this case that using that layer control array was not appropriate for you, that'd be great feedback. And we could go chat to the Maps team and say, hey, maybe there's a way we could have some generic control that you could move around that had similar styling or something. But as it turned out, it worked well for that library, and it sounds like it might work for you.
It will. It's not layer technically, but a full screen control is sort of kind of in that world, and isn't far from map, satellite, and a screen control. I could sort of see those being related without being too crazy, Yeah,
as long as it's intuitive to the end user, and
right, exactly.
And that seems appropriate to me. All right, so. And I assume you had no trouble joining this Hangout.
No, I did last week's with Mano, so...
so you were prepared.
So it took me a while to get on because he had to see the comment and then add me to the circle and then let me join. So it was a little bit challenging. I've done other ones. I've done other... I guess it was not Maps API office hours. It was a Google Map office hour. Previously,
we changed them so that we have the ability to live stream them on YouTube, so anyone can watch but not necessarily participate in the Hangout itself.
Which is a great thing.
It changes the workflow, so we sort of have to grant explicit permissions, and so that's why we have this new extra step. Any other questions while you have us?
Well, let's see. Party office hours, indeed. I guess I was to go back to that. I was going to ask if there was a style guide in general for controls and things. Obviously, I can see what is part of the API, but I was wondering if there were guidelines for what is recommended for custom controls.
No, we really leave it up to you because we like to see developers come up with some creative ways of, when people are able to make whatever they want, then maybe they'll think of something we never did. We don't want to say, here's the way to make controls. But we do put out examples, and so there's, the Maps v3 examples page you mentioned. There's also I think there's a controls page in the documentation which gives some additional examples. And the style of those examples is just what we consider a reasonable way to program against the API. But certainly if you want to build something that looks outlandish or does something really strange with different JavaScript libraries, then you should take full advantage of the API to do that.
Yeah, I noticed that the examples to make it easier and obviously really portable, it uses JavaScript to construct the divs and the other elements and the styles, and it assigns those using JavaScript inline. And I actually found a technique, since my maps page is already using jQuery, you can just do $jQuery and put HTML in there, and it automatically creates that, and then do a get 0, and you don't have to worry about it. And also, it wasn't clear that you could do CSS. It was my own mental failing of not realizing that ultimately this is part of the DOM, and standard CSS, if you have IDs or classes, will be applied. You know, you don't have to specify everything in the JavaScript like you do in your examples, which I understand why you do in the examples, but I sort of thought it was you can only do it that way.
Point, and we could probably add a comment in some of our examples that makes it clear the reason that we're inlining the HTML and CSS is because we want a single example there, and not because that's necessarily the recommended approach for JavaScript developers to create new DOM elements. But you know, there's always good running debate on that. You can find anywhere as to where the cutoff is between too much HTML and CSS and just a tiny little jQuery div that you want to insert or something. So I think that's really up to each developer, and a little bit separate from our API. But yeah, we could make comments in there that make it clear why we're doing it that way. So I think even though we're not sure how many people are potentially watching on YouTube, we switch over to introducing the style map stuff, and that's what we'll do now. So I think you can see a shared screen up there. Can you confirm if you see a shared screen of our showcase?
I do. I'm using a MacBook Air, and I see the large window is you, and then I see my head, and then I see the screen. And if I click that, it switches to the screen.
I got the same thing. So I think we're all set. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking about this developer showcase here, which is fairly new. I'm not sure if any of you guys have noticed that we put up some new layout in our developers.google.com for a showcase for maps. And all of our maps documentation and some other documentation is also up there at the developers.google.com. So pretty nice resource. And notice that the URL here is developers.google.com/maps. And one of the most obvious things you can do here is hit the big red View Showcase button. And there's lots of great examples in here to kind of pull ideas from some of the different creative ways people are using maps. And you can take a look, obviously open up the JavaScript behind these pages, get an idea of what people are doing in this space. And today I wanted to talk about style maps, because it's one of my favorite features. And so what I'm going to do is bring open this filter here. I can choose to look at only a subset of these maps, and I'm going to choose the ones that take advantage of our styled maps. Quite a few. I'll just bring up a couple to prove the point of what styled map is. Basically what it is this idea that you can customize the look and feel of the base map. You know, when you go to maps.google.com, we have a whole bunch of stuff on the base map that's really designed for visitors of maps.google.com. A whole lot of people looking for driving directions, looking for places. That might not be the same story that you're trying to tell with your mashup. And so what we have here is a bunch of different people using styled maps to tell their story a little better. I like this one, Maps Without Maps. Let me bring that up. So this one, it's kind of hard to see what you're looking at here, but what they've done is removed all the features except for the labels. I think it's kind of silly, but it's a little bit clever. And then, cool. Is this what you did?
No, I didn't do it, but it's really cool.
Yeah, I like the idea. I probably wouldn't have thought of this myself. And then as we zoom in, we can start seeing you know, all of the populated places and the relative sparseness in some areas of the country. And anyway, the point here being is we can remove a lot of features and show just some features to tell a really different story than you usually see with maps. So maybe there's not a lot that you can do with that map to prove the point of how you can do really cool styling and see the world in a different way. Let's take a look at another great example here, this Eagle map. This is a really simple map, but what I like about it is it proves the point that if you really want to tell us a story that has your data on top, you're probably best off getting rid of all of the distracting elements that might otherwise be on the map. You know, again, our sort of default-based map, we want to show you where the freeways are, where the local transit stations are, and all of these different things. probably not relevant to this use case. So all they've done here is toned the saturation way down to get a nice grayscale map. And now their markers really pop. They can style it, and it kind of looks like our colors aren't competing against their brand colors in their website. So just the simple idea of toning down the saturation is a great way of seeing how styled maps can make it a little bit less distracting to overlay your data on top. And we'll look at some more examples later. I see we have a couple more people joined us. So before I go into a couple more examples and then how you might create your own styled map, I've got Davey here. Okay, great. And yeah, if you have any questions, Davey, you're welcome to ask.
Just wave your hand if you have a question.
If you have a question. He's got a question. He's always got good questions. How are you doing today? I think you were muted there. Are you possibly still muted on your end, Davey?
I was still muted, yeah.
Okay, we're all set.
Yeah. Doing great. Just booked my flight and hotel for Google I/O. So.
Oh, you got your tickets. Congratulations. It'll be great to see you there. Excellent.
Yeah. Actually, I had a question on the Street View API. I don't know if that covers the Google Maps family, but.
We'll try our best to answer it. You're welcome to ask anything. We'll just say we don't know if we don't know.
Okay. It's from an Android perspective, basically. Would it be possible to kind of load up a KML file or something, or a collection of geo points, and stream it into kind of a Street View animation?
KML points. Stream it. Okay, so there's a few different things going on there. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think what you're asking is if you have a bunch of locations in KML, perhaps a line, perhaps a bunch of place mark points, and you want to be able to just display a slideshow kind of effect with Street View, sure, you could do that. So ignoring the Android part of things, which I'm less familiar with, as you probably know from our previous conversations, certainly the Maps API, you can grab the location data out of the KML and then make a separate call to the Street View, either static image API or the full-fledged API, and have it move at whatever timing it is that you see appropriate. There's no sort of built-in read this KML but display in Street View. You'd have to parse it yourself and do the separate calls. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think I can pretty much figure it out how to do it like web-based. But I was wondering, as there is this native Street View Android application, is it possible to leverage the capabilities of that native Android app?
That's a really good question. I think that the answer is no, but I'm not 100% sure of that. Not that you can't use that Street View API, but rather I don't think there's really a direct tie to read into KML and then say follow it along kind of a thing. So I'll have to ask the Android team, or if you want, you can join one of the Android office hours and ask them. But I'd be happy to pass on the question to them as well. I don't know that offhand. Yeah, sorry. Oh, he looks like he's got another question there. I'm not sure if I muted him. Yeah, can't hear him. I think you're potentially muted still. He's got another question. Okay.
Again muted, yeah. I saw the demo that you guys did in Austin with the cab thing,
yep.
OpenGL demo. Is there like any example source code available for that?
There's not currently a great example, but we're going to go into a lot of detail about how we did that and some cool things with WebGL and Maps at the WARE conference, which is, I think, like next week. So I should probably start prepping seriously for that. And we're going to probably have some things there and afterwards that would be pretty exciting.
Yeah, it was a cool demo, by the way.
Yeah, there's a lot of really amazing potential, I think, with using the WebGL, so that's some pretty exciting stuff. So I'm not sure if they're live streaming all of the workshops where I know they're doing the talks, but perhaps not the workshops. So we'll definitely be publishing some stuff online in the days and weeks following the conference, though.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Talks, but perhaps not the workshops. So
out of questions.
Okay, out of questions. All right.
Want to show some more demos?
Yeah. Do you want to talk about style maps at all, or show any examples or demos, or should I hop to it?
Oh, go ahead.
Me? Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Well, what's that?
What's
Freedom of the press.
freedom of the press.
That one looks nice.
That does look nice. Have you heard of this one?
I might have heard of it.
You might have heard of it. Why don't you describe a little bit about what we're looking at here, this Freedom of the Press website. Wait to load. Or give us an intro. What do we have here, Kat?
Actually, I'm not too sure of the details of what this map is showing. I'm guessing it's related to freedom of the press somehow.
Oh, I thought you knew all about it. Okay,
don't
that's
know
fair.
all about
well, let's take a
it.
look.
It looks like a very nice style map.
It is a nice style map. Well, so what they've done here is just overlaid the country polygons. And one of the things you often see when you have semi-opaque polygons here is that, again, an unstyled map can detract from this overlay story because we're going to have all of these different colors and so forth pop out. And so, again, they've just done a... Oh, go ahead.
I think I know one thing about it, though.
Oh, yeah, let's hear it.
I believe it uses fusion tables in the backend.
Oh, to draw these polygon overlays.
To draw the polygons.
Yeah, that's a whole other usually tricky problem to solve aside from styling the map is how do you get nice big data overlays like this. So that is a really good point. So if you have lots of your own custom data, fusion tables is a great thing to look at. Let me take a quick look and see. Is this the same as the newspaper map where they had a ton of overlays? Has a link to it.
There's a lot of markers on it.
Have a lot of markers.
Yep.
So same thing, and I think this is also a styled map. But again, going back to that same general idea of styled map is if you have a story to tell, you're probably doing well by really making sure that the only things that help your story, in this case like labels and where the countries are, but remove the things that detract from your story, maybe lots of colors or other things that would potentially conflict with your overlays.
Yeah, especially like this one, the markers really pop on it.
Exactly.
Really stand out.
Yeah, and if these were overlaid on top of an unstyled map, it would be a lot more difficult to see the pattern and different markers. You'd be distracted by the background. Okay, so let's go ahead and say if we wanted to create our own style map, I'm just going to give a really brief introduction. In my opinion, the easiest way to do that. The easiest way is to do a search, your favorite way to search, which for me is just typing up top for Google Maps style wizard or something along those lines, and hitting an early link that takes you to this style maps wizard.
And isn't there a YouTube video as well?
Oh yes, we have a great screencast that also goes over that. So I'll see if we can get a link up here or tell you how to find our screencasts. But meanwhile, let's take a look at the style maps wizard, which basically starts you out with our default map here. Let's pick a location, say Seattle, where I used to live. Also notice the Places API autocomplete. If you aren't using that and you're asking people to type in locations, then think about taking advantage of Places API autocomplete. And here we have our basic map. This is what our default map looks like and what the majority of maps out there looks like, but no need for your map to look like this. And so this is just a kind of a wizard that lets you change, for example, I mentioned earlier, go to a grayscale view and already there's a lot less distractions on the map. Or you could, tone it up a notch and also go feature by feature. So if I just want the water, for example, to have a different hue over here and maybe be a little bit darker, then I can do that. And then I can go ahead and add this style right here, clicking this add button to my set of styles. And then I could take something else, like say the roads, and let's just simplify those, make them a little bit cleaner. So now we have a much cleaner, less labels and so forth, thinner lines. Go ahead and add that style. And then some other things that we could do, we could take just the geometry of our administrative areas and turn all of those off. And various other things like that, or what have you. So there's a lot of great examples of style maps out there, but use this wizard, and then when you're done with the wizard, go ahead and hit this Show JSON button down at the bottom of your set of map styles. Here's the syntax we use to style the maps, and you can basically cut and paste this into your Maps API application, along with just one or two lines where you can pass into your map object an extra parameter, styles, and then you just feed it this, and it'll take over your base map style with whatever you've customized here. So it's really easy to add styles to your map. And this also applies to terrain, and you can also create a separate map layer where someone clicks a button and it takes you to your style map and so forth. And we have examples of all of that in our examples page. So anyway, I would recommend checking out this wizard if you just want to start playing with how different styles could look and going down the granularity of features that you can turn off, turn your parks a little bit more green, and so on and so forth. So that's an overview of the style maps. Do you have anything to style maps?
No. Very nice map.
Beautiful, yes. Not a cartographer by trade, obviously.
That makes it very easy.
Yeah, it does make it easy. Easy to play with. So, yeah. Do we have anyone else on here with questions?
Can you replicate how they created that one map without anything except for the labels?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's try that. That's a good idea. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this and remove these guys. Cool. Goodbye. So here's our basic map again. Let's see if I can figure it out. The first thing I'm going to do, I've never tried this, is turn everything off. Boring map. Let's add that style. And then I'm going to go to our labels and turn everything on. And we're done. That was easy.
Very easy.
Yeah. Now I might want to say, this is pretty cool, but the freeway labels I don't love as much. The rest, so I could add this style that we have here. And then say, just for the roads, let's go ahead and turn those guys off. And now we just have the other labels of all administrative areas. So you can take advantage of making sure that you're applying your labels in order, and you can kind of see the effect that we have here. If you change the order, you're going to have a different effect. Okay, I think that's it. So let's see here. I'm getting some notes. Oh, let's go to our moderator questions. Good idea. Excellent idea. We have some questions. I think that this first question, I'll give it a big check mark. Excellent question. We answered. So, are you using Street View images to find and interpret business signs and add places to Google Maps that way? The answer here is we do look at a lot of the data that comes back from the Street View cars, and we run all kinds of analysis on that data, ranging from where the cars are and taking into account all kinds of things that they interact with along the way. I don't know for sure if we're using OCR recognition on business signs. It's kind of a tricky problem. You got all these little A-frames out on the sidewalk and different labels that might or might not apply to the business itself that might be in the window. I'd have to ask the team. My guess would be they've thought of that, but certainly the best way, if you're thinking about adding your business, would be to add it in MapMaker, not put a big sign in your window and wait for the car to go by. So, but good question. I'm not sure offhand, and my guess would be that's a tricky issue that would probably only, in the best case scenario, apply to a small amount of businesses. I don't know if you have any extra insight.
I do not.
Okay, that's fair. Okay, next question. Let's see here. Why does it take as much time to update the Street View images?
Good question.
Okay, shall I answer the question? Okay, well, it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of things that have to occur. First of all, we have to have someone that taken the images, so you have to drive a car around, which is time consuming. And so you can imagine, as soon as we're done in one area of the country, we don't just immediately redo that city. There's other interesting areas maybe we've updated less often. It's kind of a similar question of why don't you update your satellite imagery in Google Earth everywhere over the whole world every day? And the answer is we always have to decide for the cost that it takes to acquire the imagery and process it, what's the most positive effect we can have on all of our users worldwide. And so with Street View, turns out there's just a lot of roads. And so that the biggest slowdown is obviously driving the cars and getting back the imagery, or perhaps taking the boats down the Amazon and getting the imagery. There's just tons of new areas to go out, and it's time-consuming to do that. But then after we drive through a place, obviously we have to post-process all of that data and make sure that the quality is appropriate and make sure that it's sort of better imagery than we had before, and then get it in through our systems and put it out. But all of that time and processing is obviously less than you're going to see us back in the same area, probably, because we just have so much more new area to cover. Hopefully that answered that question. I don't think that person's here.
I always wonder that same thing too, actually.
Yeah, why don't we just have cars everywhere all the time?
Yeah. And sometimes I'll see a car driving around. You're like, oh, maybe someday I'll be on Google Maps. I'll keep checking that one spot, but I never see myself there. Someday.
You should file a vote with it too. Why aren't I on Google? So moving on, we've answered the MVC control question previously, and then we answered that one. I think we are done. I think we answered all the questions. We have no more questions.
There might be one more.
One more question. Did someone just add a question? Oh, yeah. Oh, here's a question. I have made a wrapper to make it simpler for people to pick up and use the API. Now I'm having trouble with geocoding API requests when dealing with multiple instances. Any tips or suggestions are welcomed. So first, just when you mention the word wrapper, I'm not familiar with your project offhand. I'd point out that we do have one clause in our terms of service that relates to building a wrapper library around the Maps API itself. And I would suggest reading the terms of service, search for the word, I think wrapper, but read them through and make sure that you're not potentially violating any of the terms in there. And if you have a question, you can toss us a note on the forum for clarification or otherwise ask here specifically if you have a question about that. Second question is trouble with geocoding requests. I'm not sure what trouble is exactly, but I'm guessing based when you said multiple instances that you're using server-side geocoding and that as more people are using your servers to do geocoding, you're running out of quota. That's just a guess with no additional context. And if that's true, I'd suggest that you certainly use client-side geocoding. So each of the users that makes a geocoding request, that quota is being applied against their IP and not against your server instance. So we have a blog post written by my colleague Mano or an article rather, about what the difference between client-side and server-side geocoding is. So just do a search for that. And again, not familiar with your library, but chances are you want to be using client-side geocoding. So hopefully that answers that question. And it looks like Davey's got his hands up. So more tricky questions. Ready?
Not tricky at all, I think, but a question anyhow. I think it's for Catherine, this one. It's regarding fusion tables and security. In my application recently, I've been starting to use the document list API to access the fusion tables and to enable sharing of fusion tables in my Android application.
Okay,
using the document list API, which is, I think, the appropriate way to share fusion tables from a Java application.
Yep, that's right.
I'm using I'm using OAuth 2 for that, for security. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that I need to provide the Google document scope there. Mm-hmm. So although I'm only interested in fusion tables, the user basically gets to see that my application wants to access all of his documents. Is it possible to define like a more narrow scope through the document list API so that we only target fusion tables and the user is made aware of that?
That's a good question. Not that I know of. I think you just have to use the scope that they have listed in the Google Documents List API. Fusion tables is part of the Google Documents List. That's why it's using that scope. But definitely it's something I can look into and find out more information for you.
Yeah. Okay. Would it be possible to, like, I don't know, log a feature request or something like that for that? Because I think within the OAuth framework there is like a mechanism to define more narrow scopes. I think the Google Attitude API, for example, allows you to define various levels of scopes in terms of what you want to see. Mm-hmm. So I think in theory it should also be possible with the document list API.
Yes. Yes. And please do open up a feature request. That's a great idea.
Okay. Then I had another question. I think that's more of a Google Latitude question. I seem to recall, but I'm not 100% sure, that a couple of months ago, Google Latitude worked for Google app domains, non-Gmail domains. And recently I kind of discovered that it doesn't work anymore.
Okay, that's I don't know offhand. I'm not aware of any changes that would have suddenly made it not work on apps domains. I actually have not tried it myself on an apps domain. And I don't know the answer to that either offhand. But if you want to toss a note on G+ to me asking that question, I can find out really quickly and get back to you.
I logged an issue in the Latitude issue tracker.
Okay.
I noticed on the Latitude website, it gives you, it kind of allows you to activate Latitude from a Google Apps domain, but it doesn't really activate it. It's kind of a bug in the website, I think.
That sounds very much like a bug. Yeah, let me look into that. I'll take a look at your.
I'll forward you that
today. Onto the team. We'll see what's going on.
And then final question regarding reverse geocoding, which we talked about a couple of minutes ago. I'm also doing reverse geocoding in my application client side using the standard. I think it's the Android reverse geocoder that I'm using. And very often, I'm getting no response at all. I'm getting like this internal error or something. And I don't think that it's quota related. Because sometimes, for example, for the first time today when I'm starting the app, it immediately gives me an error. And like 2 minutes later, it's able to reverse geocode the address. So it's very randomly that it returns an error.
What do you know what the error is offhand?
I could look it up. It's some kind of internal.
Well, that also definitely. I mean, I can't say for sure it's possible it's quota related or something, but it sounds like we should file an issue there as well. And if you could just apply the kind of exact error that it is and the call that you're making, see if you can nail down what's going on.
I don't think it's related to the actual location, because sometimes when I'm at a fixed point, where I know it is able to reverse geocode that latitude, longitude, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, and again, I would suggest, I know the Android guys are having their regularly scheduled office hours. Ask them that same thing.
Yeah, I'm already bothering them.
The error message as well.
Yeah.
And I think they have active office hours every day, so perhaps even in an hour or two from now. I'm not sure what time it is. You're in the Netherlands, I think.
Belgium. I think they have one.
Apologies.
Not an offense.
Vaguely similar area of time zones.
Yeah, exactly.
Somewhere over there, yeah. So I think they're still having them later on today, our time, but otherwise they have a list of scheduled hours for all of their office hours. You could ask them that.
And can I just ask one question? It might be a silly question, but the phone is connected to the internet when you're making requests?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Good question.
Using Wi-Fi, 3G. I think I don't know. It's a very random thing. It's a very simple API call to make. You can't do any like client-side errors with that. It's just a simple call, reverse geocode a certain location point, and like I said, sometimes it works.
Interesting. If it's only occasionally failing, but usually working, well, first of all, definitely let's try to figure out what's going wrong here. But as a workaround, you could potentially fall back to using a web service on fail. So have a server-side call if it's just occasionally failing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sounds like if you're making a reverse geocode for the exact same place, and it doesn't work, and then it works, something's amiss. It could be it's not just a daily quota. It's also a quota of if you ask a bunch of times in kind of a burst, that will also get you a denied message. So it's hard to say without sort of seeing what the call you're making and what the error is. But
yeah, I'll have an issue for it. I'll make sure I have the exact error message.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
You're always finding out good edge cases for us, so that's great.
Yeah, I would make a great tester probably.
Okay. Any other questions? No. Okay.
And, if anybody's on YouTube,
Oh yes.
reminder of how to join.
Yes, if you're on YouTube, you should. Your time is running low here, but you can try to make a run for the G+ stream of Mono Marks or myself, and wherever you saw this post, and you can ping Mono and ask them to add you to a circle, which will then allow you to join the Hangout Live and ask questions. Okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. Did you have anything else you wanted to cover?
Nothing.
Use file maps, please.
Yes.
think that was the main takeaway I wanted to give you guys. And
really cool style maps.
Okay. Oh yes, one more question. Yeah, we're ready for it. Yeah. Ask away, captive audience.
Okay, so last one. So I was trolling Stack Overflow for Google Maps API questions, trying to get some that I could answer. And there's one which is a reference to a tutorial done by Google where you use the static map API to put a static image in, and then when the map fully loads, you switch the static image with the live content using the API. But that particular tutorial/example uses the version 2 API. So the version 2 JavaScript Maps API, not the version 2 static Maps API. And so the person on Stack Overflow was asking essentially Google, but I think someone else may volunteer to update the API part of the tutorial for version 3.
Yeah, so the true answer is that's we should probably.
And I guess fundamental question is that a good practice?
It is a good practice,
Still.
And in fact, the V3 API automatically does this under certain circumstances. For example, on a mobile device, or if there's a relatively low bandwidth connection, we will, by default, load a static map and then bring in the full JavaScript API when it's finished loading. So if you're looking on a mobile phone, it's very likely what's occurring anyway by default in a web page where you're just loading the maps v3. So you don't need to go to any extra effort at all yourself. But on a desktop website, we might not do that, and if for some reason you did want to do it, or another common use case is you just have a bunch of pages on your website, and you think it's unlikely someone might click on the map for any interactivity. You just need a little thumbnail there. There's no need for you to load up the entire JavaScript API each time. You could just load the static map, and then when someone clicks on it or something like that, bring in the full interactivity. So there are some use cases for doing that, and it's not a bad idea for us to update the example to show that feature. But yeah, if you're just concerned about having a little speedier instant access to someone looking at a map on a mobile device, and that's the reason you're interested, note that the V3 API automatically does that for you. Also, if you are going to take any of these approaches, pay attention to the quota of maps that you're using for static and regular JavaScript API loads. Did that answer your question? You muted.
That did. Sorry, I muted too.
Okay.
But yes, that answered the question. So.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, one more question, I think.
Yeah, sorry.
No, don't be. It's great. I want you to answer questions.
What do you guys think of the performance of Google Maps when run through a web view on a mobile device? Because usually what you do is like in Android or in iOS, you have like these dedicated map components that you can use, native components, that are very responsive. They support like pinch and zoom very well, all these fancy gestures.
Yeah, it is. Obviously going to be faster to run the compiled code of the native application than it is to load the web view. So it is it's just inherently faster to do that than to have an embedded browser load up the JavaScript and then compile and run that on the fly. And that's always going to be true. That said, there are still a bunch of additional features that we have in the JavaScript Maps API that aren't, as you know, in the native one. So it's just a choice you as a developer if the features meet your needs for whatever hardware you're running on, which one to use. But I think it is pretty speedy. It's a pretty speedy load, like we mentioned in the last question. You get a map very, very quickly. Is it a few hundred milliseconds here or there potentially before everything occurs? I'm not sure exactly what the tests are. It's always going to be a little faster no matter what to run things on a native app.
Yes, especially when you like load up lots of markers on the map and you try to like navigate through the map really quickly. That's something that you can do in a really fancy way on the native component. Like you put a bunch of markers, like I have in my application, I put a bunch of markers on the map. I have this play button. I replay all of my locations on the map component, which is really fluid in the native component. Whereas if I load it up on the standard browser in a web view, it's actually, yeah, it's not a tad slower, but it's a lot slower, if you know what I mean. And I was wondering, is there like, do you guys see that progressing in the sense that with Chrome coming to Android, might that give better performance, or do you see stuff like WebGL also coming to mobile devices in the near future?
Well, slowly WebGL is being made available on more and more phones, and the hardware of phones, of course, is getting better. And at the same time, we're trying really hard to optimize all the features on Maps v3 to be as snappy as possible on the whole spectrum of devices that are out there. So if you're seeing a regression in terms of something that used to be faster with, say, 100 or 1,000 markers, or thousands, potentially pushing the limits of some phones, then let us know, because it should certainly not be getting slower. It should be getting faster. And we are trying to take advantage, if the browser can support something like Canvas or different techniques that we can use to make the markers snappy, then we'll use those techniques. So you should be able to get increasingly more and increasingly faster markers over WebView. And if you're seeing the opposite of that, definitely give us a heads up.
I'm not seeing the opposite. It's just comparing it with the native component. Like the speed gap is it's substantial. I mean.
Okay, that's good feedback. I'm definitely gonna chat again with the team. I know they're aware of a lot of different phones out there and trying to make things as snappy as possible. Yeah, and again, there's always going to be some optimal things that you can do with a native application, no matter what you want to do compared to running it through a web view. But that said, we should certainly try to make sure that those cases where there are 500 plus markers to display, it's feasible to do that in some way on WebView.
Okay.
Without any kind of noticeable slowdown if possible.
Yeah. Because my company is they're trying to move away from the entire native development thing. They want to do like cross-platform HTML5 developments, like write once and run it on any device, which I don't really think is technically possible all the time. So, but we're trying to see what the capabilities are of like using the JavaScript in the JavaScript Maps API in a web view and see what the performance is. But
yeah, absolutely. And if you do notice something where you think I have no idea the number of markers you're doing and exactly what kind of effects you're doing to them and so forth, that seems like it's not what you would expect. File a feature request or a bug and say this doesn't seem quite right, because Maps v3 should be pretty snappy on mobile devices, certainly for many hundreds of markers. It should not be a noticeable slowdown on any modern device.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Okay, I think we're going to finish it up here. So thanks a lot, guys, for joining us and for all the good questions. We'll be back, I think, next week. I'm not sure the exact date, but you can check our RSG Plus streams, and we will look forward to seeing whoever wants to join us next week. So thanks again for coming by.